For as long as artillery has been in the game, it has been hated, and it's really no wonder. Prior to patch 9.18, artillery used to exist in a state that if you were unlucky enough to get hit with a high penetration AP or HE shell, you were nuked right off the map. But now, artillery exists in a very strange and very annoying state. And this is thanks to the feature we all know and love, stun. So it's really not surprising that a large number of the players want this class to be all out removed, or at the very least changed so that it's actually bearable to play against. And while we know the first option is a pipe dream and that will never happen, and I'm sorry Chems, the second one is more plausible, and many others and I have proposed different ideas of how we could actually go about balancing artillery. However, to my surprise, I found there was a sizable amount of players who were very alarmed and opposed to any potential changes to artillery, and I wasn't getting this feedback just from artillery players. One of my own subscribers expressed a genuine concern that any artillery nerfs and changes that would decrease Arty's effectiveness may be an indirect buff to haul down monster tanks like the 279E or Chieftain and notably the BZ-176. So wanting to take the matter actually seriously, I had to answer the question, does artillery help counter haul down monster heavy tanks, and is it effective in doing so? So today we're going to answer this question and we're going to say whether it's a myth or truth, as well as debunk another known myth about artillery. And right after we've done this, I'm going to be proposing several different ideas of how we can make the class of artillery more skillful and dynamic to play, and more importantly, less annoying to play against. And for those of you guys who are shorter on time or attention spans, I've created timestamps so you can skip between the myth busting or the solutions as you please. I'm doing this because I know I have ADD and I would appreciate something like this, so I'm looking out for you guys. But do me a favor and let me know what you think about the myth or truth, or additionally, what is your favorite solution that I've listed in this video. And with that said, let's get right to it. I want to start by having you consider this. Most classes have natural counters to one another. Medium tanks face other medium tanks and are often outbrawled by heavy tanks who have more HP and armor. Light tanks face other light tanks, and often it's a competition to see which team's light tank will outspot the other. With heavy tanks, they have their armor negated by high penetration TD rounds, while they're also outmaneuvered by the superior mobility of medium tanks. So it's not unnatural to think that overpowered hull down tanks should also have a natural counter, and some people think it's artillery. But what exactly does artillery do in order to counter these vehicles? Well, not only does artillery chip away and damage these tanks, it also has the ability to slow them down with its stunning effect, as well as push them out of hull down positions that are not artillery safe. Additionally, it also punishes tanks like the 279E for making aggressive plays and pushing out too far. And if you can continually stun these overpowered heavy tanks, it might give your team a chance to send these tanks on an early trip back to the garage. And when it's put this way, it at least seems like a plausible theory that artillery could be the natural counter for these clearly overtuned tanks. However, this is where it becomes really important to be able to differentiate between a vehicle's intended role that it's supposed to have and the actual way that real players play the tanks. And this is really where this idea that artillery can be the natural counter for overpowered hull down tanks starts to fall apart, because we're relying on players who are some of the most casual players in the game to know and actually follow through with their vehicle's intended purpose of targeting these specific overpowered tanks. It's bad enough when you have a T110E3 player who thinks that because they're a tank destroyer, they're supposed to camp in the back, and obviously this goes to aid the enemy team. However, when you have an artillery player that doesn't know their intended purpose, not only is it hurting your team because they're not focusing the priority targets that are hull down monsters, it also creates misery for the enemy team because when they're not shooting these targets, they're going to be going for more available and soft targets that are easy to get more damage on. The main point that I want to drive at is that the existence of the class of artillery cannot be justified just because of the imbalance of a handful of problematic tanks. Not only is this reliance on artillery as a balancing tool not a direct way of dealing with these imbalanced tanks, it is not an effective way either, and I'm gonna go over a couple different reasons, some of which I've already mentioned, why this is the case. The first reason is quite simple, and this is because of Wargaming's map design. There happen to be actually quite a few locations where overpowered tanks can go without having to worry about being countered by artillery. This goes without saying that if we were relying on artillery to counter these positions, it's simply never going to happen because they just can't hit them. And speaking of artillery not being there to help, One of the other reasons why it's an unreliable way to balance is because it's just not in every single match. The matchmaker can't control when the amount of artillery players is low, and thus you're just not going to be able to distribute enough artillery players to every match where there's going to be an overpowered hull-down heavy tank. This of course is actually assuming that most artillery players know how to play artillery effectively and know to counter these problematic tanks in the first place. But of course, most of us know this is a highly idealized version of artillery, and I am not alone in this observation. Plenty of the people I asked this topic about on forums observe that artillery players often shoot the most available and easy target to hit rather than the target that is deemed the most priority. And to be honest, I sometimes even find myself doing it. I think it's just the idea that we like seeing big numbers on a screen, and we can't help but click something that's going to be able to give us that. And this issue of artillery players often choosing non-priority targets is only further complicated by the fact that sometimes these tanks are very well armored, so the actual payout and the actual damage you're getting is much less than a soft and squishy medium tank that is sitting stationary that they can hit just as easily. And this was still a problem even prior to the 9.18 update, when artillery did a lot more damage with HE rounds. There's a reason why these tanks were still considered very overpowered, even despite the fact that artillery was able to slap them for 600 damage as opposed to 300 damage now. And for anybody saying that these tanks became more overpowered since the artillery nerf, it's much more likely the fact that it's because that HE nerfs came at the same time, which made HE shells lose their viability as an actual way to counter these overpowered heavy tanks. But what never loses its viability is actually directly addressing the problems that these tanks have in the form of direct nerfs. Both the Chieftain and the Object 2790 have seen performance decreases after the nerfs, and I think this is exactly what needs to be done for the BZ-176. And I know some of you guys will say to me that premium tanks cannot be nerfed because there are legal issues with this. However, this is another myth that we're going to bust in another video. All things considered, while artillery has the potential to help counter overpowered hull-down heavy tanks, because of the players who play this class and the complications that add to its unreliability, this idea and prospect will only ever be a plausible myth, and a myth nonetheless. However, if I am positive about anything being a myth, it is the idea that artillery prevents camping. To be honest, I have no idea how this myth got popularized in the first place, but we're going to shortly go through why this is definitely not the case. Now, I want you guys to think back of when I was talking about artillery's ability to affect the gameplay of overpowered hull-down tanks. Everything I said in that, the ability to slow down tanks, the ability to stun them, push them out of positions where they're hull down, are all the same things that artillery can do to literally any type of tank. What this means is that because artillery has the ability to influence the gameplay of all tanks, there are going to be players who want to avoid risk and who are going to camp instead of making those game-winning plays. Now, some of you guys may already be thinking, don't tank destroyers have this same effect of promoting campy gameplay? And to that I will say yes they do, but this has much less to do with tank destroyers' inherent design and much more to do with the fact that Wargaming's poor map design does not give ample opportunities for light tanks, the natural counter of tank destroyers, to actually do their job and outspot these camping TDs. I will also say that at the very least, tank destroyers have to be in line of sight of their enemies in order to actually affect their gameplay. For artillery, this is not the case, and it means they actually don't have any natural counter. And this is where I think we need some new ideas to help improve the skillful and dynamic side of artillery. But before I get into any actual solutions, I need to make an important disclaimer. Any of the solutions that I'm going to give are not out of spite for artillery. I understand why people like to play this class, and I understand that it's not a small amount of players. That's why when I propose any of the changes that I'm about to share, I've thought about how the artillery players may take it, and I've thought about their ability to adapt to these very changes. However, what I've also been keeping in mind is the majority of players who don't play artillery as arty mains, and who are often on the receiving end of artillery in its current state. It's a pretty well-known fact that a lot of the community does not like artillery in its current state with stun. And in my representation of these ideas and consideration of them, I'm not going to be apologetic about proposing ideas that would greatly reduce artillery's effect on our games. If somebody wants to say that's biased, that's okay. I don't care. However, I do care about this game's health enough to actually make a video on it. So please, before you write a comment to me on how much I hate artillery, take a moment to consider that I could just as easily post something on Reddit complaining about the state of artillery. but instead I've actually made a video for you guys proposing actual solutions on how we can improve the state of the game. So if you're not here to actually advance the conversation and you just want to troll and say, oh, another person crying about artillery, the state of artillery, then I'm going to moderate the comment section as I please. So please don't waste your time, don't waste my time. And with that out of the way, let's get rolling. So now it's time for me to put my hat in the ring, and I'm going to propose 5 plausible ideas with the goal of making artillery much more skillful to play, more dynamic, and more importantly, less involved and influential in the games of players who actually play actual tanks. Let's get right to it. The first thing we need to establish, of course, is where artillery has evolved from. And the reason we're doing this is to know what type of changes Wargaming is actually willing to make towards the class of artillery, so that we can propose plausible ideas that actually have a chance of being implemented. Now, as I already mentioned previously in the video, prior to patch 9.18, artillery used to have high penetration HE and secondary rounds that would nuke players right off the face of the earth. Now, Wargaming obviously knew this was broken, however, they ended up replacing this with an equally broken mechanic that significantly debuffs all the different characteristics of your tank. You know, only the most essential ones you need to play the game. Basically effectively taking you out of the battle without actually nuking you. So instead of wasting your time by getting one-shotted by an artillery, we are subjected to a slow and often painful death under the stun mechanic. Now, Wargaming wanting to throw a bone to the players, in update 1.13, we saw several soft nerfs to the class of artillery. Now, I would say most of these are actually pretty useless, but there's one in particular that I think is actually worth mentioning. Now, obviously, you see the markers on the map that let you know when artillery fired, but it's not really useful if the artillery is focusing you to know that it just fired. Wow, that's amazing. Cool. Now, the other one that we saw was 3 different shell types, which is interesting. It makes the class of artillery more dynamic, but it's not exactly going to fix the problem that artillery missions need stun. Therefore, most of the players are going to be using the stun shell anyways. So it's not like you're going to be reducing the amount of stun by giving players a choice of firing non-stun and stun shells. Anyways, I digress. The sound detection skill is basically useless if you're not in a tank that can actually dodge it. If you're in a mouse, your T95, Tortoise, yeah, forget about it. You're getting fucked by artillery. Now, finally, the one that's actually kind of useful is tracers. This allows you to see where artillery is approximately firing from, but due to the rendering of how we actually see the shells, you're not able to see the actual location. And I think this is a mistake by Wargaming to not do this, because while it is nice to actually one-shot an artillery at distance on Prokhorovka in your medium tank or your heavy tank, what there really needs to be is encouraged counterplay between artilleries. And this is something that I am going to outline in my ideas later on in this video. But the most recent change we've seen to artillery has come in 1.18, and this saw a soft limit on the number of SPGs that could be in each battle. Now, as per Wargaming, they say that there's a limit of 2 SPGs per battle unless the matchmaker cannot find another vehicle type to substitute, and in that case, there'll be 3 SPGs in a single battle. Now, to their credit, I've seen less battles where there are 3 SPGs and even 2 SPGs sometimes. However, I think there could be more done, and that's why for my first idea, I'm proposing that we limit the number of SPGs to 1 per battle, and only in cases where it is actually impossible to not have this should there ever be 2. Now, some of you guys may be thinking, wouldn't this change mean that we'd see more battles with 1 artillery per team? And to that, I would say yes, but you'll also be seeing less battles where there are 2 artillery. So I'm actually going to be arguing why this option is much better than the current situation we have now, because dealing with 2 artillery is really hard in a battle if they are focusing you, or if you're a heavy tank and they have you in a corridor locked down. I think a lot of us have experienced when artillery are firing every 15 seconds and you've been permanently stunned. The flank literally becomes unplayable because you're just going to be missing your shots constantly. Every 15 seconds a shell comes in and you're stunned. You can't play. Having 1 artillery that stuns you every 30 seconds is much more manageable. And as a side note, sometimes it's actually really nice as a light tank player to have the support of an artillery when your team really can't shoot. Guys, we're in a pretty sad state where more than half of the people really can't hit their shots, and somehow artillery can. So sometimes it's really nice. Now, I want you to keep in mind that in combination with the next 2 ideas, artillery is going to be a lot less annoying to play against, especially since it's 1, but also because the next 2 ideas are going to be addressing the actual stun mechanics and the changes that need to happen to it, because stun should never exist in the game. It shouldn't have been a thing, but we have it and it is here to stay because it's literally built into the missions. And if history has told us anything, even throughout many different iterations of artillery changes, Wargaming has refused to change any of the stun missions. So it makes me think that any stun duration changes are out of the question, so we are then left with two different options of how we can actually make stun much more bearable for the players who have to experience it. Now, these are two options I came up with, and I am very open to more ideas, so please let me know what you guys think of this. The first option that I came up with is simply by actually making stun like stun in other games. In Call of Duty, when you are flashbanged, you are loaded with movement, your reaction speed is much more sluggish, and then you snap out of it gradually. I think stun should be much more representative of this. So within the first 3 seconds, you are at that 30% debuff, and then as you get out of those 3 seconds, it'll gradually fade off into almost nothing. I think going from like a 30% down to like a 5% debuff would be something that players would be much more happy with than the flat 30 that you get throughout your whole entire stun duration. That is terrible. Now, when I'm actually referencing that flat 30, what I actually mean is all the different characteristics that are changed. I made a mistake because I heard from somebody that it was a 30% flat. That is wrong, but I'm leaving in the video because I am way too lazy to re-script and record everything so that I can fix that mistake. So just know that when I'm referring to that, I'm referring to all the different characteristics that are debuffed. The other way we could just change the stun, the second option, would be taking down the stun down to a flat, I don't know, 10 to 5%. Now, whatever the number be, I just think that 30% debuff is just way too much for artillery to be having an effect on our games. And listen, it's not like we're removing it. The Arty players can still feel like they're farming stun and getting the stun assist. As long as they feel like they're clicking and actually doing something, I couldn't care less. 5% is literally like going without events. I think that's so doable, and I think players would actually be able to live with stun in this case if we actually have to keep it, which is the reality. We have to keep it. So these are my two options. Let me know what you guys think of these two, and if you'd rather do something else. Now comes for the fun part. I want you guys to remember when I said I wanted to make the class of artillery more skillful and dynamic. I really mean that. I think the class of artillery is way too easy. And playing a class that is able to damage from across the map with almost pure immunity is dumb, and it should come with drawbacks. So I've come up with ideas to actually make them use their keyboards. Imagine that. In real life, when artillery fires, guess what? They have to reposition and do so quickly within minutes because there's radar that detects when artillery fires and where from to a very precise degree. This means that if they stay in the same location, they get obliterated by counter battery fire. This should be a feature in World of Tanks. In other games like Armored Warfare, I believe it's a thing, and I think something like this within at least the first 5 minutes, if not the whole entire duration of the battle, should be a thing to give the opportunities for artillery players who are using their brain to counter other artillery players. Hell, I think maybe there should be achievements for it so we can actually reward artillery players for playing well against other artillery players. And this is all done so that artillery players can cannibalize one another and take away some of their focus from actual tanks playing the actual game. Now, I have other ideas on how I think this could be done. I think that tracers need to render more fully, as in, instead of the current state, which I'm going to show you in this video right here, where they render like, I don't know, 15 meters away, they need to render right from the barrel. And if this were paired with brighter tracers in the aerial view so that we can see where artillery are firing from, this would be great because we'd be able to see where artillery is without exactly knowing where they are. They'd be lit without being lit, essentially. I think that should be a thing because you know what? It's really not that hard to move, I don't know, 15 meters away from where you just fired. And because artillery shells come within like, I don't know, 5 seconds, that is more than enough time for that artillery to reposition. And good artillery players don't have a problem with this because they literally move as soon as they fire. So this should just be a thing that players are able to get used to. Listen, every one of us has to be able to use their keyboard, has to be able to react, has to be able to adapt to different situations. Artillery players having to move a couple keys on their keyboard is not asking a lot. And I don't think that this type of change would break the gameplay of artillery players. Now, in the search for ideas that would make artillery much less dumb and much more skillful, I also thought of a countermeasure to artillery, which is an idea borrowed from Armored Warfare, this feature being that players actually know when artillery is aiming at them. So in World of Tanks, this might look like players having an indicator that tells them after 2 seconds or immediately that artillery is aiming at them, which gives them an extra opportunity to move out of the way or to get into cover before they are shot at. Now, the reason why I did include this idea in my top 5 ideas is because I think this might be considered redundant by Wargaming because there's already a sound detection skill that tells you when artillery is fired at you. If they already deem that to be enough, then an idea like this they're going to say is just unnecessary when they already have another feature. And we know that developers are proud of what they've already put out there, so something like this may be borrowing a little bit too much from Armored Warfare, and that's why I didn't include it in the top 5 ideas. But to the credit of Wargaming developers and the balance department, when they did nerf the M44 and rebalance the characteristics of lower tiered vehicles, I think this showed a decent level of competency, because they actually understand that the new player experience of getting spammed by a LEF or M44 at the time was conducive to losing new players and their player retention. And these new players are what are needed for the game's longevity to continue, and for us older players to continue to have games where we're able to farm a bunch of noobs for those legendary 10k games. Now, I fully understand that there's some idiots who've been playing the game who are like 44% win rate. However, there's also those new players that contribute to our good experiences. The main point being that making the new player experience less crappy benefits us all, because Wargaming benefits of having more potential customers, and we benefit from having more potential tourists to farm in our games. Simple as that. I also think Wargaming would do well to consider changes like these that would help the majority of players' experience and their quality of life in the game, because it has the potential to bring back some of the old players that may have left for quality of life issues like artillery, and because it helps the retention of players who have been complaining about this and who have been giving their feedback a chance to feel like they're actually being listened to. Now, I'm one of the people who says it's better late than never. I know some people out there are going to be like, screw artillery, it's removed and this is not enough. But I think this is the happy medium ground for Wargaming to actually show that they care about player feedback while also keeping artillery in the game. I also want to shortly highlight the monetary incentive that there is towards balancing artillery. The majority of players are non-artillery players, and the majority of players that actually pay for this game are also non-artillery players. So the math would have it that if you piss off the players who are paying for your game, you make less. And the opposite can also be true. If you please the players who are paying for your game, they're much more likely to stay invested and pay more, and this benefits us all and the health of the game because it makes it more free to play. And if all of this seems like a lot of effort going in towards justifying why Wargaming should make artillery less relevant in our games, it's because it has taken a lot of effort and it did take a lot of time. So that's why I would really appreciate if you guys took the time to comment down below what is your favorite of these different ideas, and also to like this video and consider subscribing to the channel if you want to see more ideas that address the big issues that this game has. We're talking about matchmaking, we're talking about balancing games, and also the map design. These are all different topics I want to cover, and that I'm going to take the time to carefully consider both community feedback and perspectives from Wargaming so that I can come up with the best ideas that actually have a chance at being heard and implemented. If you guys want to see my perspective on this, stick around, and I will catch you guys in the next discussion-based video later this month. I hope you guys have a good day. Thanks for watching. Peace.